Picture this. You're walking through the opulent halls of a French castle in 1314 when you hear something that makes your blood run cold. Behind closed doors, a teenage queen, barely 18 years old, is calmly discussing the most efficient methods to eliminate her husband. Not divorce him, not banish him, kill him. What you're about to hear is the true story of how an innocent young bride became one of medieval Europe's most calculating killers. And before you think you know how the story ends, let me tell you, the truth is far more disturbing than any fiction. Comment below to let me know where you're listening from, because we're about to explore one of history's most haunting tales of power, betrayal, and the terrifying transformation of a teenage girl into a ruthless queen. But first, hit that like button and subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be remembered. And the deeper we dig into this medieval nightmare, the more shocked you're going to be. In 1308, 13-year-old Isabella of France stood before the altar of Boulogne Cathedral, her hands trembling, not from cold, but from the weight of the golden wedding ring being slipped onto her finger. Her new husband, Edward II of England, was 24 years old, devastatingly handsome, and according to every account from that day, completely disinterested in his young bride. Isabella wasn't just any 13-year-old. She was the daughter of Philip IV of France, one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. Her father was known as Philip the Fair, not for his sense of justice, but for his striking blonde hair and piercing blue eyes. Those same eyes now watched from the crowd as his daughter became Queen of England, sealing a political alliance that was supposed to bring peace between two warring nations. But Isabella had inherited more than just her father's legendary beauty. She had also inherited his ruthless intelligence and his capacity for calculated cruelty, though no one suspected it yet. On her wedding day, Isabella looked every inch the perfect medieval princess. Chronicles describe her as having cascading golden hair that caught the light like spun silk, porcelain skin that seemed almost luminous, and those same penetrating blue eyes that could shift from innocent to calculating in an instant. She stood barely 5 feet tall, but there was something about her presence that commanded attention. What made Isabella's wedding day particularly heartbreaking was how desperately she seemed to want her new husband's approval. Historical accounts tell us she had spent months learning English customs, practicing her pronunciation, and studying everything she could about Edward's interests. She was determined to be the perfect English queen. But there was one massive problem that would destroy everything she had prepared for. Edward II was completely, hopelessly, and very publicly in love with someone else. And that someone wasn't another woman. Piers Gaveston was everything Isabella was not. Where she was delicate and refined, he was bold and magnetic. Where she was obedient and proper, he was rebellious and charismatic. And where she was Edward's wife, Piers was Edward's obsession. When Isabella first met Gaveston at her wedding feast, she probably thought he was just another court nobleman. But then she watched as her new husband's entire demeanor changed the moment Piers entered the room. Edward's eyes lit up, his posture straightened, and for the first time all day, he smiled. A genuine, radiant smile that Isabella realized with growing horror was never going to be directed at her. Gaveston was a Gascon knight, born in southwestern France but raised in the English court. He was handsome in a completely different way than Edward, darker, more dangerous, with the kind of magnetic personality that drew people in like moths to a flame. And he had something that 13-year-old Isabella could never compete with: Edward's complete and utter devotion. The extent of Edward and Pierre's relationship was scandalous, even by medieval standards. They shared everything: clothes, jewelry, beds, and most importantly, power. Edward showered Gaveston with titles, lands, and riches that should have gone to the Queen or to other nobles. But what made it truly unbearable for Isabella wasn't just the public humiliation. It was watching the man who was supposed to love her, protect her, and build a life with her treat her like she was invisible. Imagine being 13 years old in a foreign country where you know almost no one, married to a man who acts like you don't exist. Every meal, every court function, every public appearance became a reminder that you were nothing more than a political necessity. While your husband and his lover laughed together, wore matching outfits, and whispered secrets, you sat alone, watching your marriage become the joke of two kingdoms. But Isabella was learning. Every slight, every humiliation, every moment of being ignored was teaching her something crucial about power and survival. And slowly, very slowly, something dark began to grow inside the heart of the teenage queen. The English nobles hated Gaveston almost as much as Isabella did, though for different reasons. They saw him as an upstart foreigner who was corrupting their king and threatening the stability of the realm. In 1312, they decided to do something about it. Isabella was 19 when she learned that Gaveston had been captured and executed by a group of rebellious nobles. The man who had stolen her husband's heart, who had made her wedding day a nightmare, who had humiliated her for 4 years, was dead, beheaded on a hill in Warwickshire, his body left to rot as a message to the king. You might expect Isabella to feel relieved or even secretly pleased. Instead, historical sources suggest she felt something much more complex and disturbing. Because watching her husband's reaction to Gaveston's death taught Isabella the most important lesson of her life: how much a person could suffer when someone they loved was taken away. Edward II fell apart completely. He sobbed, he raged, he locked himself in his chambers for days. He threatened war against his own nobles, spent a fortune on elaborate funeral rites for his dead lover, and spoke constantly of revenge. For the first time in their marriage, Isabella saw her husband display raw, devastating emotion. And she memorized every detail. This was the moment when something fundamental shifted inside Isabella. She began to understand that the greatest weapon against someone wasn't a sword or an army. It was knowledge of what they loved most. And more importantly, she began to understand that sometimes, to gain power, you had to be willing to destroy the very thing your enemy cherished. But Edward's grief also presented Isabella with an opportunity. With Gaveston gone, maybe, just maybe, her husband might finally turn to her. Maybe they could build the marriage she had dreamed of since she was 13. Maybe this tragedy could become the foundation of something real between them. For a brief, shining moment, It seemed like Isabella's patience might finally be rewarded. She was catastrophically wrong. Just when Isabella thought she might finally have her husband's attention, Edward found someone new to obsess over. This time, it was Hugh Despenser the Younger. And if anything, this relationship was even more destructive than the first. Hugh Despenser was everything Gaveston had been, but worse. He was greedier, more manipulative, and infinitely more dangerous. Where Gaveston had at least possessed charm and charisma, Despenser was coldly calculating. He saw Edward's weakness and exploited it ruthlessly, accumulating power and wealth at an unprecedented rate. But what made Despenser particularly unbearable for Isabella was that he actively worked to undermine her. Gaveston had simply ignored the Queen. Despenser saw her as a threat to be neutralized. By 1322, Isabella found herself in an impossible situation. She was 27 years old, the mother of 4 children, and ostensibly one of the most powerful women in Europe. But in reality, she had no authority, no allies, and no escape from a marriage that had become a prison. Despenser convinced Edward to restrict Isabella's movements, control her finances, and monitor her correspondence. She couldn't travel without permission, couldn't meet with foreign dignitaries without supervision, and couldn't even write letters to her own family without them being read and censored. This is when Isabella began to change from a victim into something much more dangerous. A strategist. She started paying attention to everything: who held power, where the weaknesses were in Edward's government, which nobles might be turned against the king. She cultivated relationships carefully, presenting herself as the loyal, suffering queen, while secretly building a network of supporters who were growing increasingly frustrated with Edward's incompetent rule. And she began to nurture a very specific kind of hatred. Not the hot, impulsive rage of youth, but something cold and patient and infinitely more dangerous. In 1325, Isabella's opportunity for revenge finally arrived, though it came disguised as a diplomatic mission. Edward needed someone to negotiate with Isabella's brother, Charles IV of France, over disputed territories in Gascony. Who better to send than his own wife, the French king's beloved sister? For the first time in years, Isabella was free. Free from Despenser's surveillance, free from Edward's neglect, free from the suffocating atmosphere of the English court. And in that freedom, the woman who had been building inside the teenage bride finally emerged fully formed. Isabella didn't just negotiate with her brother, she conspired with him. She didn't just discuss territorial disputes, she planned invasion. And when Edward sent their 14-year-old son, Prince Edward, to France to pay homage for the Gascon lands, Isabella made a decision that would change the course of English history. She refused to send him back. Think about the calculating coldness of this move. Isabella was holding her own son hostage against his father. She was using a child as a political weapon. But from her perspective, she was finally playing the game by the same ruthless rules that had been used against her for 17 years. When Edward demanded that she return to England, Isabella's response was swift and devastating. She publicly declared that she would not return to her husband while that man, meaning Despenser, remained in power. But privately, she was planning something much more radical. She was planning to destroy Edward II completely. While living in exile in France, Isabella did something that shocked medieval Europe. She took a lover, not quietly, not secretly, but openly and defiantly. Roger Mortimer was a Welsh nobleman who had been imprisoned in the Tower of London for rebelling against Edward. He had escaped in a daring nighttime raid and fled to France, where he met the exiled queen. Mortimer was everything Edward wasn't: decisive, dangerous, and utterly devoted to Isabella. Where Edward had humiliated her with his male lovers, Isabella now flaunted her relationship with Mortimer as a deliberate act of revenge. They appeared together at public functions, shared living quarters, and made no attempt to hide their affair. But this wasn't just about romance or even revenge. Isabella and Mortimer were planning an invasion of England, and they needed each other to make it work. Mortimer brought military expertise and connections with Edward's enemies. Isabella brought legitimacy, foreign support from her brother, the French king, and most crucially, she brought Edward's own son and heir as justification for their cause. By late 1326, Isabella had assembled an invasion force. It wasn't huge, maybe 3,000 men, but it was enough. Because Isabella had spent years identifying Edward's weaknesses, and she knew exactly where to strike. The moment Isabella's ships appeared off the English coast, Edward's support began to collapse. Nobles who had endured years of Despenser's greed and Edward's incompetence flocked to Isabella's banner. Cities opened their gates without a fight. The woman who had once been dismissed as a powerless teenage bride was suddenly commanding an army and toppling a kingdom. But Isabella wasn't content with just victory. She wanted Edward to suffer the way she had suffered. She wanted him to experience the loss of everything he loved, just as she had been forced to watch her marriage dreams die year after year. When Isabella's forces landed in England in September 1326, Edward II and Hugh Despenser fled westward toward Wales. For the first time in his life, the king, who had always been surrounded by luxury and comfort, found himself running for his life, sleeping in forests and begging for food from peasants who increasingly refused to help him. Isabella pursued them relentlessly. This wasn't just a military campaign, it was a hunt, and Isabella was savoring every moment of her husband's terror and humiliation. Think about the psychological warfare she was employing. Edward had spent years making Isabella feel powerless and invisible. Now she was making him feel hunted and desperate. He had taken away her dignity. She was taking away his kingdom. He had ignored her. Now she was making sure he couldn't escape her attention. When Despenser was finally captured in November 1326, Isabella made sure his execution was as brutal and public as possible. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, torn apart while still alive as crowds cheered. His head was sent to London and displayed on a spike. Isabella wanted Edward to know exactly what happened to the man he loved, just as she had been forced to watch Gaveston's execution years earlier. But Despenser's death was just the appetizer. The main course was still to come. When Edward himself was captured in Wales, Isabella faced a crucial decision. She could have him imprisoned for life. She could force him to abdicate and live in exile. She could even have him executed publicly as a deposed tyrant. Instead, she chose something far more sinister. Isabella didn't just want Edward dead. She wanted him to suffer first. So she devised a plan that was psychologically devastating in its cruelty. First, she forced Edward to abdicate in favor of their 14-year-old son, making herself regent. Edward had to formally hand over the crown that he had worn for 20 years, publicly admitting his own incompetence and acknowledging his wife's superior claim to power. Then she had him moved from castle to castle, each one progressively more uncomfortable and degrading. Edward, who had spent his life surrounded by luxury, was housed in increasingly squalid conditions. He was forced to shave off his distinctive long hair and beard. His elegant clothes were replaced with rough peasant garments. But the worst part was the isolation. Isabella made sure Edward had no visitors, no letters, no contact with the outside world. The man who had thrived on attention and admiration was left completely alone with his thoughts and his guilt. This systematic stripping away of Edward's identity and dignity wasn't random cruelty. It was carefully calculated revenge. Isabella was making Edward experience powerlessness in exactly the way she had experienced it. Every humiliation was deliberate. Every degradation was payback for years of neglect and contempt. And through it all, Edward knew that his wife, the teenage girl he had ignored and dismissed, was orchestrating every detail of his downfall. By 1327, Isabella faced a problem. Edward was still alive, and as long as he lived, he posed a potential threat to her regency. Deposed kings had a tendency to inspire rebellion among those who preferred the old regime. Living martyrs were dangerous. But executing a crowned king, even a deposed one, was unprecedented and potentially catastrophic for her own legitimacy. Isabella needed Edward to die, but she needed it to look like natural causes or an accident. This is where the true depth of Isabella's transformation becomes clear. The teenage bride who had once dreamed of a loving marriage was now calmly planning her husband's murder with the same attention to detail she might have once devoted to planning a court festival. According to contemporary chronicles, Isabella and Mortimer sent specific instructions to Berkeley Castle, where Edward was being held. The orders were verbal, nothing in writing, and they were very clear. The former king was to die, but in a way that left no obvious marks of violence. On September 21st, 1327, Edward II died at Berkeley Castle. The official cause was given as natural illness, but rumors immediately began circulating about the true method of his death. The most persistent and most horrifying account claimed that he had been murdered by having a red-hot iron poker inserted into his body through a horn funnel, causing massive internal injuries while leaving no external evidence. Whether this gruesome story is true or not, what's certain is that Edward's death was too convenient, too well-timed, and too beneficial to Isabella's position to be anything other than murder. And Isabella, the teenager who had once wept at her wedding, had ordered it all. In the immediate aftermath of Edward's death, Isabella appeared to have achieved everything she could have dreamed of as that 13-year-old bride. She was the effective ruler of England, governing in her teenage son's name. She had unlimited wealth, unchallenged power, and the satisfaction of having completely destroyed the husband who had humiliated her for 20 years. But victory came with an unexpected cost. The nobles who had supported Isabella against Edward II began to grow uncomfortable with her rule. They had backed her when she represented legitimate grievance against an incompetent king, but watching her wield absolute power alongside her lover, Mortimer reminded them uncomfortably of the corruption they had just overthrown. More disturbing was the change in Isabella herself. The woman who had once been praised for her beauty and grace was now described by chroniclers as hard, cold, and paranoid. The teenager who had wanted nothing more than her husband's love had become someone capable of ordering that same husband's brutal execution. Power, it turned out, was more addictive than love had ever been. For 3 years, Isabella ruled England with iron control. She and Mortimer lived lavishly, accumulated vast wealth, and made decisions without consulting Parliament or the nobility. They had learned the lesson of Edward's reign, that weakness invited rebellion, but they had perhaps learned it too well. Because Isabella had forgotten one crucial detail. Her son, Edward III, was growing up. By 1330, Edward III was 18 years old, older than his mother had been when she first began plotting against his father. And he had been watching, learning, and planning. Edward III had spent his entire adolescence watching his mother rule in his name while conducting an open affair with Mortimer. He had seen how the nobles looked at him with pity, calling him a puppet king controlled by his mother's ambition. And most damaging of all, he had begun to suspect the truth about his father's death. The young king, who had been raised on stories of his mother's justified rebellion, was now old enough to see that rebellion for what it really was: regicide, usurpation, and ruthless ambition. In October 1330, Edward III staged his own coup. It was swift, decisive, and utterly devastating for Isabella. Mortimer was arrested, tried for treason, and executed within weeks. Isabella herself was spared execution. She was, after all, the king's mother. But she was stripped of all power and confined to Castle Rising for the rest of her life. The teenager who had once dreamed of love, who had been transformed by humiliation into a calculating killer, who had tasted absolute power and found it intoxicating, was now facing the same imprisonment and isolation she had once inflicted on her husband. The circle was complete. Isabella lived for another 28 years after her fall from power, dying in 1358 at the age of 63. Those final decades were spent in comfortable but isolated captivity, with plenty of time to reflect on the choices that had brought her from a wedding altar to a prison tower. What must it have been like for her during these long years of solitude? Did she regret ordering Edward's death? Or did she still feel it was justified revenge for years of humiliation? Did she miss the intoxicating rush of absolute power? Or was she relieved to be free from the constant calculation and cruelty that ruling had required? Contemporary accounts suggest that Isabella's beauty faded rapidly after her imprisonment, as if the artificial preservation of power had been the only thing maintaining her legendary appearance. The golden hair turned grey, the porcelain skin wrinkled, and those piercing blue eyes grew dim with age and regret. But perhaps the most haunting detail is that Isabella reportedly spoke often about her husband in her final years, not with hatred or anger, but with something approaching nostalgia. The man she had destroyed had become, in her memory, the lost love of her youth, rather than the source of her humiliation. Whether this represented genuine remorse or simply the confused recollections of an aging woman, we'll never know. But it suggests that even Isabella herself was disturbed by what she had become. Isabella of France died on August 22nd, 1358, at Castle Rising. Her final request was to be buried wearing her wedding dress, the same gown she had worn as a 13-year-old bride, full of hope and dreams of love. It's impossible to know what she was thinking in those final moments, but the symbolism is devastating. The woman who had ordered her husband's brutal murder wanted to be remembered as the innocent girl she had been, before power and revenge consumed her soul. Isabella's story is one of the most chilling examples in history of how systematic cruelty can transform a victim into a monster. She didn't start as evil. She started as a teenage girl who wanted nothing more than to be loved by her husband. But years of humiliation, neglect, and powerlessness slowly carved away her empathy, her morality, and ultimately, her humanity. The truly terrifying thing about Isabella's transformation is how logical each step seems when viewed from her perspective. Every act of revenge was justified by a previous injury. Every escalation of cruelty was a rational response to her circumstances. Every choice that led her deeper into darkness was made by someone who had been forced to choose between survival and morality. By the time Isabella was capable of ordering Edward's death, she was no longer the same person who had married him 20 years earlier. The teenage bride had died slowly, piece by piece, humiliation by humiliation, until only the calculating queen remained. And perhaps that's the most disturbing lesson of Isabella's story. That monsters aren't born, they're made. They're created by systems that strip away dignity, relationships that destroy trust, and circumstances that make cruelty seem like the only path to survival. Isabella of France began as every teenage girl's fairy tale fantasy. A beautiful princess marrying a handsome king. She ended as every parent's worst nightmare. A woman so consumed by the pursuit of power that she was willing to destroy everything and everyone in her path, including the man she had once hoped to love. Her story deserves to be remembered, not because we should admire her ruthlessness, but because we should understand how easily the innocent can become the irredeemable. In a world where power often demands the sacrifice of humanity, Isabella's transformation from victim to killer serves as both a warning and a tragedy. The teenager who once wept at her wedding had become the queen who never wept again, not even when ordering her husband's death. And in that absence of tears lies the true horror of Isabella's story. Not that she was capable of murder, but that by the end, murder no longer caused her any emotional pain at all. The innocent bride was dead. Only the killer queen remained. And she lived with that transformation for 28 long years, in a tower room that was both her punishment and her protection. A place where the kingdom was safe from her ambition, and she was safe from the person she had become. Isabella of France, the teen queen who ordered her husband's brutal death, and in doing so killed the last innocent part of herself. Her story is a reminder that in the game of power, the greatest casualty is often not the victim, but the victor's own soul.